Picture a fortress city under the relentless desert sun, its defenders gaunt, its walls scarred by months of siege. The banners of the Crusader states hang limp in the still air, symbols of a cause pushed to the very edge of annihilation. In the command tents, hope is a dwindling resource. This is the moment history often overlooks, the quiet space between the thunder of battles, where the true turning points were forged not in open combat, but in whispered conversations between sworn rivals. We are taught to see the Crusades as a simple story of cross against crescent, a centuries-long clash of faiths. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if the most decisive victories and the most dramatic escapes from defeat were actually orchestrated through secret handshakes and hidden agreements among those who were supposed to be bitter enemies? This is the story of 25 forgotten alliances between enemy orders that changed everything. We are about to journey past the famous names and the well-documented battles into the shadows of history, where the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and others made choices that defy the simple labels of friend and foe. Why would knights who competed for every scrap of land, every ounce of influence, and every donation from Europe suddenly choose to cooperate? The answer lies in a brutal, unspoken truth: survival often trumps ideology. When faced with a common threat that could wipe them all out, these rival orders discovered that pragmatism could be a more powerful weapon than pure religious fervor. They engaged in a dangerous game of realpolitik, forming temporary pacts, sharing crucial intelligence, and even pooling their vast resources, all while maintaining a public facade of rivalry. This video is an excavation of those hidden dealings. We will uncover the clandestine meetings in Jerusalem's back alleys, the coded messages passed between castles, and the shared financial ventures that built formidable strongholds. We will explore why these astonishing collaborations have been so effectively scrubbed from the popular memory of the Crusades, often because they complicate the clean, heroic myth we prefer. By the end of our exploration, you will see this era not as a straightforward religious war, but as an incredibly complex and fluid geopolitical chessboard, where loyalties were as shifting as the desert sands. The knights on this board were not just holy warriors, they were diplomats, spies, bankers, and survivalists, capable of astonishing flexibility when their existence was on the line. Prepare to have your understanding of this pivotal era completely transformed, as we reveal how cooperation among enemies became the ultimate strategy for survival, beginning with our first astonishing example. Think of the Crusader states not as a single, unified kingdom, but as a collection of fiercely independent fiefdoms, each with its own army, its own treasury, and its own ambitions. At the heart of this fractured world were the military orders, organizations like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, who were far more than just soldiers. They were international corporations, landowners, and banks, each answering to their own leadership and their own set of rules, all the way back to the Pope in Rome. This structure meant that from the very beginning, competition was inevitable. They were all vying for the same scarce resources: parcels of land to build their castles, control over lucrative trade routes, and perhaps most importantly, the generous donations from pious nobles back in Europe. A new castle for the Templars was a direct blow to the prestige of the Hospitallers. A wealthy patron choosing to endow one order meant that another would go without. This created an atmosphere of intense, often bitter rivalry, where these groups viewed each other not as brothers in arms, but as the primary competition in a holy land where power was the ultimate currency. Their very identities were forged in this contest for influence, making the idea of them working together seem almost unthinkable. Yet, it was precisely this environment of constant pressure and one-upmanship that made temporary alliances not just possible, but sometimes essential. When a threat emerged that was too great for any single order to handle alone, a massive invading army, a siege that was draining resources, a political crisis that endangered them all, a fascinating calculation had to be made. Could they afford to stand on principle and risk total defeat, or was it wiser to momentarily join forces with a rival to secure a shared victory? This is the crucial backdrop for our story. The deep-seated rivalries make the alliances we are about to explore so remarkable. They were not born from friendship or shared ideals, but from cold, hard necessity. They were the ultimate strategic gamble, a decision to see a rival not as an enemy, but as a temporary partner in a desperate bid for survival. This complex dance of conflict and cooperation sets the stage for our first astonishing example of a forgotten pact that turned the tide of a crucial battle. Now, let's step into the year 1153, to the dusty, sun-baked plains outside the formidable city of Ascalon. For decades, this Fatimid stronghold had been a dagger pointed at the heart of the Crusader kingdom, a base for raids that constantly threatened the road to Jerusalem. The Christian army, led by King Baldwin III, had surrounded the city, but the siege was dragging on for months. The defenders were well supplied, the walls were immense, and the Crusaders' morale was sinking with every passing day. This was the definition of a stalemate, a brutal war of attrition where sheer exhaustion threatened to decide the outcome. In the Crusader camp, the tension was not just between the Christian forces and the city's defenders, it was also simmering among the Crusaders themselves. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, the two most powerful military orders, maintained their separate encampments, their rivalry as thick as the summer heat. They viewed each other with suspicion, each believing their own strategy was the key to victory, each wary of the other gaining too much glory from the eventual triumph. But as the siege wore on, a grim realization began to dawn on the leaders of both orders. Their individual efforts were simply not enough. The Fatimid defenses were too strong, and the cost of continuing this disjointed assault was becoming unsustainable. In a moment of profound pragmatism, senior commanders from both the Templars and the Hospitallers made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. They agreed to a temporary truce, a suspension of their bitter rivalry for the sole purpose of achieving a single, shared objective, the fall of Ascalon. This was not a declaration of friendship, it was a cold, calculated military pact. The terms were likely simple but revolutionary. They would coordinate their assault strategies, no longer launching separate, uncoordinated attacks that allowed the defenders to focus their resistance. They would pool their intelligence, sharing whatever their scouts had learned about the city's weakest points, the sections of the wall that had been damaged by siege engines, or the gates that were less heavily guarded. Most importantly, they would time their final, all-out assault to happen as one unified force. The result was a masterpiece of coordinated military action. When the signal was given, the combined knights of both orders, fighting side by side under a temporary, agreed-upon command, hurled themselves at the compromised sections of Ascalon's walls. The defenders, accustomed to facing fragmented assaults, were suddenly overwhelmed by a single, concentrated wave of steel and determination. The breach was made and the city fell. The capture of Ascalon was a monumental victory, securing the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for a generation. But the true lesson of that day was far more subtle than the simple capture of a city. It demonstrated that even the most deeply entrenched institutional rivalries could be set aside when survival was on the line. The success at Ascalon proved that collaboration between rivals wasn't a sign of weakness, but a devastatingly effective strategy. It created a blueprint that other orders would observe and, in their own moments of desperation, attempt to follow, setting the stage for an even more secretive and surprising partnership just a few decades later. Just over 2 decades after the triumph at Ascalon, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced a threat that made that earlier siege seem like a minor skirmish. The brilliant and ambitious Sultan Saladin had unified the Muslim forces of Egypt and Syria, assembling a vast army with the explicit goal of wiping the Crusader states from the map. In the autumn of 1177, this formidable host, numbering in the tens of thousands, surged north from Egypt, its target the very heart of the Christian kingdom. Standing in its way was a force so small it seemed almost insignificant, led by a young king whose very survival was a question mark. Baldwin IV, the Leper king, was only 16 years old, and his illness was advancing. To many, he and his outnumbered knights represented little more than a speed bump on Saladin's march to glory. The situation demanded not just bravery, but something truly extraordinary, a tactical miracle. And that miracle would be born not from a grand public alliance, but from one of the most secretive and unexpected partnerships of the entire Crusader era. While the Templars were the most famous and feared knights in the Holy Land, another order existed in their shadow, one dedicated to a mission that most found terrifying. The Order of Saint Lazarus, known as the Lazarites, was founded to care for those afflicted with leprosy. Their members included knights who had themselves contracted the disease, and they operated hospitals and shelters, living on the fringes of society. To the high-ranking Templars, the Lazarites were often overlooked, their martial capabilities underestimated in light of their primary, sorrowful work. But in this moment of ultimate crisis, the Templar leadership saw past the stigma. They recognized that the Lazarites possessed a form of power that no other order could claim, an intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the land. Because their members often traveled to remote areas to care for the sick, and because they were so frequently marginalized, the Lazarites had developed an intricate understanding of the desert wadis, the hidden paths, and the secret water sources that were invisible on any map. A discreet agreement was struck, a pact so covert that its details remain shrouded to this day. The Lazarites would provide a cotta of their most skilled scouts, men who could move like ghosts through the harsh terrain, men who knew every rock and dune between the Crusader camp and Saladin's advancing army. In exchange, the Templars likely offered protection, patronage, or a promise of greater inclusion, a lifeline of recognition for an order that lived in the shadows. This was an alliance built on complementary strengths, a perfect fusion of the Templars' overwhelming shock power and the Lazarites' deep, localized intelligence. The Lazarite guides led the small, desperate Christian force on a daring flanking march through the desert, using routes that Saladin would have deemed impossible for a large body of knights and their horses. They emerged from the dusty wastes not in front of Saladin's army, but to its side near the swampy terrain of Montgisard. The surprise was total. Saladin's army, confident and stretched out on the march, was completely unprepared for a disciplined heavy cavalry charge materializing from an unexpected direction. The Battle of Montgisard was not a prolonged engagement. It was a swift, violent ambush that turned into a rout. The Templar Knights, inspired by the presence of their young king fighting in their midst, smashed into the Muslim ranks with devastating force. Saladin himself only narrowly escaped, his army scattered, its baggage train captured. The victory was stunning, a feat that saved the kingdom from what seemed like certain collapse. But the true significance of Montgisard lies not just in the battlefield triumph, but in the nature of the alliance that made it possible. It showcased a different kind of military genius, one that understood victory could come from leveraging the unique, often hidden, strengths of the most unlikely partners. The Templars, for all their pride, had the wisdom to look beyond their own formidable reputation and see value where others saw only weakness. This lesson in pragmatic cooperation, of finding strength in the margins, would soon be tested again in a very different theater of war, where the battlefield was not the desert but the sea. The success at Montgisard, born from an alliance of stealth and local knowledge, showed what could be achieved on land when rivals focused on a single objective. But just over a decade later, the nature of the conflict shifted dramatically, moving from the dusty plains to the waves of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of cooperation would prove equally vital. The scene was Acre, the most important port city in the Holy Land, and the year was 1190. The Third Crusade, a massive effort led by Europe's most powerful monarchs including Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France, had become bogged down in one of the longest and most grueling sieges of the entire era. For nearly 2 years, the Crusader army lay encamped outside Acre's massive walls, suffering from disease, hunger, and relentless counterattacks from the city's defenders and the relief forces of Saladin. It was a brutal stalemate, a test of endurance where the outcome would be decided not by a single glorious charge, but by which side could sustain its forces the longest. Control of the sea was the absolute key to this struggle. Acre relied on supplies brought in by sea, and the Crusaders needed a constant flow of reinforcements, food, and equipment from Europe. Whoever commanded the waters offshore commanded the fate of the siege. This is where an unlikely partnership emerged, one that would defy the established hierarchies of the crusading world. On one side were the Knights Templar, an order with decades of experience in the Levant. Their network of commanderies stretched from the Holy Land back to Europe, and they had developed a formidable naval presence, operating their own fleet of transport and war galleys. They were the seasoned experts, the established power. Their new partners were the Teutonic Knights, an order that was, at this point, still in its infancy. Originally founded as a field hospital during the siege itself, the Teutonic Order was just beginning its transformation into a military force. They possessed little of the Templars' land or legacy, but they held a different, equally crucial asset: deep connections to the German merchant communities and noble houses of the Holy Roman Empire. While the Templars had the ships, the Teutons had the supply lines. Recognizing that neither could break the deadlock alone, the leaders of these two orders made a pragmatic decision. They would combine their strengths in a joint naval operation, a coordinated effort to completely isolate Acre from the sea. The Templars brought their maritime expertise to the table, their seasoned captains and sturdy vessels forming the backbone of a tight naval blockade. They patrolled the waters, intercepting any Muslim ships attempting to run supplies into the beleaguered city. Meanwhile, the Teutonic Knights leveraged their Germanic ties to secure a steady stream of essentials: grain from Sicily, timber for siege engines, and most importantly, new waves of knights and soldiers from German-speaking lands. This was more than just a division of labor, it was a symbiotic relationship. The Templar blockade ensured that the supplies the Teutons worked so hard to secure would not be wasted, protecting the Crusader supply lines from enemy raids. In turn, the constant flow of men and material organized by the Teutonic Order gave the Templar sailors a reason to maintain their vigilant watch, ensuring the army in the trenches remained strong enough to continue the fight. This partnership created a vicious noose around Acre's neck. The city, cut off from reinforcement and resupply by sea, and surrounded by a determined army on land, began to starve. The morale of the defenders cracked under the strain of this relentless pressure. The joint Teutonic-Templar naval cooperation did not win the siege with a dramatic battle. It won it through attrition and superior logistics. When Acre finally surrendered in July of 1191, it was a direct result of this sustained, collaborative effort to control the sea lanes. This alliance demonstrated a profound strategic truth. Victory in warfare is often secured far from the front lines. It showed that the most powerful weapon could be a well-supplied army or a starving enemy, outcomes achieved through shrewd management of resources and networks. The cooperation at Acre proved that alliances built on complementary logistical strengths could be every bit as decisive as those forged in the heat of a cavalry charge, a lesson that would soon lead the crusading orders to seek partners far beyond the traditional boundaries of their world. The victories secured through naval cooperation at Acre and the daring desert ambush at Montgisard demonstrated a growing sophistication in how the military orders could leverage their unique strengths. But as the 13th century dawned, the entire geopolitical landscape of the Crusader East began to shift in a way that demanded an even more radical approach to diplomacy. The traditional Latin kingdoms Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli were shadows of their former selves, their territories shrinking under constant pressure from powerful new Muslim dynasties. For the Knights Hospitaller, whose vast network of castles and hospitals required immense resources to maintain, this decline posed an existential threat. They could no longer rely solely on their fellow crusaders. Survival now meant looking beyond the familiar into the complex and often fractious world of Eastern Christianity. This strategic necessity led them to the rugged, mountainous shores of the Mediterranean, to a kingdom that was both a potential ally and a theological rival, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. Nestled in what is now southern Turkey, Cilicia was a fascinating anomaly. It was a Christian kingdom, but it followed the Armenian Apostolic Church, which had been separate from the authority of the Pope in Rome since the 5th century. This religious difference had often created tension with the Latin Crusaders, who viewed the Armenians with a mixture of suspicion and condescension, seeing them as schismatics rather than true brothers in faith. Furthermore, the Armenian kingdom had its own complicated foreign policy, frequently engaging in diplomacy and even marriage alliances with both the Byzantine Empire and various Turkish powers to ensure its survival. To the more rigidly orthodox minds in Jerusalem, the Armenians were unpredictable and unreliable. Yet, for the Hospitallers, pragmatism began to override centuries of doctrinal dispute. The Armenian kingdom was strategically vital. It controlled key passes through the Taurus Mountains and possessed a rugged coastline that could serve as a base for naval operations. More importantly, the Armenians were locked in a perpetual struggle for survival against the powerful Seljuk Turks to their east. They were experienced, resilient fighters who knew the terrain and the enemy intimately. In the year 1216, recognizing this confluence of interests, the leadership of the Hospitaller order made a bold and clandestine move. They entered into a formal agreement with King Levon I of Armenia. The terms of this pact were a masterclass in realpolitik. The Hospitallers pledged to provide direct military aid to the Armenian kingdom in its campaigns against the Seljuk Turks. This wasn't just a vague promise of friendship. It meant committing their disciplined, heavily armed knights to fight alongside the Armenian army, a significant infusion of military power for King Levon. In return, the Armenian crown granted the Hospitallers something they desperately needed, a secure territorial foothold. They were given lands, including the formidable castle of Silivke, which commanded a crucial river valley and a stretch of the coastline. Along with the land came generous trading privileges, allowing the Hospitallers to establish a new economic node in their international network, generating revenue far from the troubled heart of the Holy Land. This was far more than a simple military alliance. It was a strategic merger of interests. For the Armenians, the presence of the Hospitallers meant a powerful, permanent garrison to bolster their defenses, lending them the prestige and martial reputation of a major military order. For the Hospitallers, it was an insurance policy. The lands and castles in Cilicia provided a fallback position, a place to regroup and retain influence should the unthinkable happen and the Kingdom of Jerusalem fall completely. It transformed them from a power embedded solely in the Latin states into a truly transnational entity with a vested interest in the security of an independent Christian kingdom. The Hospitaler-Armenian agreement signals a critical evolution in Crusader strategy. It shows the orders thinking like statesmen, forming alliances based on geographic necessity and mutual strategic benefit rather than purely on religious affiliation. They were learning to navigate the intricate politics of the Near East, building bridges with local powers who understood the region in a way distant European patrons never could. This move towards geopolitically savvy partnerships, where survival trumped dogma, would soon be tested on an even larger and more tragic scale, when all the major orders would be forced to momentarily unite in the face of an apocalyptic threat. The pragmatic alliances with Armenian Cilicia demonstrated a strategic foresight, a willingness to look beyond immediate neighbors for long-term security. But just a few decades later, the Crusader states would face a threat so immediate and overwhelming that it forced the three most powerful military orders to look not outward, but directly at one another, setting aside generations of rivalry in a desperate bid for survival. The year was 1244, and the storm that had been gathering for years finally broke. A terrifying new force, the Khwarezmian Turks, erupted into the Holy Land. These were nomadic warriors recently displaced by the advancing Mongol hordes, and they were ferocious, highly mobile, and utterly merciless. They swept through the countryside, leaving a trail of destruction, and their ultimate goal was the rich coastal city of Acre. The entire feudal army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, supplemented by the military orders and a contingent of knights from the county of Tripoli, marched out to intercept them near the village of Laforbi, close to Gaza. What they encountered was not just an army, it was a tidal wave of steel and savagery. The Khwarezmian horde numbered in the tens of thousands, dwarfing the Christian force, which could muster only a fraction of that number. To make matters infinitely worse, this nomadic army was not acting alone. They had formed an alliance with the Mamluk forces of Egypt, creating a combined Muslim army of staggering size. The Crusaders were not just outnumbered, they were staring into the face of almost certain annihilation. In the command tents on the eve of the battle, the usual atmosphere of competitive pride and suspicion was replaced by a grim, chilling reality. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, each with their own commanders, their own battle standards, and their own deeply ingrained sense of independence, faced a simple, brutal choice. If they fought as three separate entities, each trying to claim the glory or simply save their own, their disjointed forces would be isolated, surrounded, and slaughtered piecemeal. Their legendary rivalry, which had defined their interactions for over a century, had become a lethal liability. In what must have been a tense and profoundly humbling council, the leaders of these proud orders did the unthinkable. They agreed to a temporary union. For the duration of this one battle, they would subjugate their individual command structures to a unified leadership. They would pool their knights into a single, cohesive fighting force, presenting a united front to the enemy. This was an extraordinary concession. It meant a Templar knight might be taking orders from a Hospitaller marshal or a Teutonic brother fighting in a formation alongside his rivals. The agreement was a testament to the sheer scale of the danger. It was an alliance born not of opportunity, but of pure, unadulterated necessity. When the battle commenced, the unified Christian center, composed of the combined might of the three orders, held firm against the initial Khwarezmian assaults with a discipline that would have been impossible under separate command. They fought as one body, their coordination allowing them to repel wave after wave of attacks. However, the numerical disparity was simply too great. The Crusader army's flanks, held by the feudal levies of Jerusalem and the knights from Tripoli, were crushed by the overwhelming Mamluk and Khwarezmian forces. With the flanks collapsing, the unified center of the military orders was surrounded. The battle turned into a massacre, yet even in this horrific defeat, the temporary alliance proved its worth. Because they were fighting as a single, disciplined unit, they were able to stage a controlled fighting retreat. Instead of a chaotic rout where every man fled for himself, the knights of the three orders covered each other's withdrawal, forming a desperate defensive square that allowed a fragment of the army to cut its way out of the encirclement and escape. Without that last-minute pact for a unified command, the entire force would have been wiped out to the last man. The Battle of Leper was one of the worst military disasters in the history of the Crusader states, shattering the kingdom's field army beyond repair. But the cooperation it inspired offers a poignant and tragic lesson. It demonstrates that even when faced with an unwinnable situation, collaboration among rivals can transform a total catastrophe into a survivable defeat. It showed that in the darkest hours, the instinct to unite could salvage a remnant of hope from the jaws of absolute despair. This desperate unity in the face of annihilation stands in stark contrast to our next example, which moves from the bloody fields of battle into the shadowy, silent world of secrets and information. While the catastrophic defeat at Leper demonstrated the brutal necessity of battlefield cooperation, another, far more subtle form of alliance was operating in the shadows, one where the weapons were not swords and lances, but whispers and parchment. If the temporary union of the military orders was a desperate public act, the relationship we turn to now was its opposite, a sustained, clandestine partnership conducted far from the public eye. This brings us to one of the most intriguing and underreported alliances of the entire era, the discreet intelligence-sharing network between the Knights Templar and certain powerful factions within the Byzantine Empire. On the surface, such a partnership seems almost unthinkable. The Great Schism of 1054 had formally divided the Eastern Orthodox Church of Byzantium from the Roman Catholic Church of the West, creating a theological and political rift that ran deep. For centuries, Crusaders and Byzantines had viewed each other with mutual suspicion, if not outright hostility. The Byzantines saw the Latins as crude, violent barbarians whose zeal often destabilized the delicate political balance they had maintained for generations. The Crusaders, in turn, viewed the Byzantines as decadent, untrustworthy schemers who had failed to properly support the holy cause. Yet, beneath this surface of religious and cultural animosity, a cold, pragmatic logic began to prevail, especially as the 13th century progressed. Both the Templars, with their vast holdings in the Levant, and the Byzantine Empire, with its Anatolian territories rapidly shrinking, faced a common and exponentially growing threat: the rise of powerful Turkish sultanates and, later, the unstoppable ascent of the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. Survival demanded a new kind of vigilance, one based not on the strength of armies alone, but on the speed and accuracy of information. The Templars were uniquely positioned for this kind of shadowy work. Their network of commanderies and preceptories stretched from the Holy Land all the way back to Europe, creating a natural pipeline for communication. Their brothers traveled constantly, their ships plied the Mediterranean, and their bankers dealt with merchants of every faith and nation. This gave them an unparalleled ability to gather rumors, observe troop movements, and intercept messages. The Byzantines, for their part, possessed an ancient and sophisticated intelligence apparatus of their own. Their spies operated deep into Muslim territory, and their diplomatic corps had centuries of experience in navigating the complex politics of the Near East. They had a deep understanding of the various Turkish emirs, their rivalries, and their intentions. A silent, mutually beneficial exchange began to take shape. It was likely never a formal treaty signed with great ceremony, but rather a series of understanding between mid-level officials and trusted agents. A quiet conversation in a Constantinople tavern, a coded message passed between a Templar sergeant and a Byzantine official in the port of Acre. The Templars might share information about Mamluk fleet movements gathered from their agents in Egyptian ports, giving the Byzantines crucial time to fortify their coastal defenses. In return, Byzantine spies operating in the courts of Anatolia would pass along warnings of an impending Turkish raid, allowing the Templar garrisons on the frontier to bolster their walls and call in reinforcements. This flow of information acted as an early warning system for both powers. A rumor of a massive army mustering in Cairo, confirmed by a Byzantine source, could give the Kingdom of Jerusalem precious weeks to prepare for an invasion. News of internal strife among the Seljuks, provided by a Templar informant, could offer the Byzantines a window of opportunity to reclaim a lost fortress. This alliance highlights a crucial evolution in Crusader strategy, moving beyond the clash of armies to the more subtle game of espionage. It recognized that knowledge was a currency more valuable than gold, and that a well-timed piece of intelligence could prevent a disaster far more effectively than 1,000 knights. This shadowy partnership, built on a foundation of shared vulnerability rather than shared faith, demonstrates that the most effective alliances are sometimes the ones that remain completely invisible, quietly shaping events from the darkness. This understanding of information as power would soon find another expression, not in secret messages, but in the very tangible, shared investment in stone and mortar. While the secret exchange of intelligence between the Templars and the Byzantines operated in the realm of whispers and shadows, the next alliance we uncover was built on something far more tangible and permanent: stone, mortar, and vast sums of money. This brings us to one of the most surprising collaborations of the entire era, a project that reveals a different dimension of Crusader pragmatism. High in the hills of Galilee, overlooking the strategic route between Acre and Damascus, stood the ruins of an old fortress. In the early 13th century, this site was identified as critically important for the defense of the kingdom's northern frontier. The decision was made to construct not just a simple garrison, but a colossal concentric castle, a state-of-the-art stronghold that would be one of the most formidable in the entire Levant. This was the project to rebuild Safed Castle. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. It wasn't merely a matter of repairing some walls. It was a complete reconstruction requiring thousands of laborers, master stonemasons from Europe, and an endless supply of timber, stone, and iron. The cost was astronomical, a financial burden so heavy that it would have strained the treasury of a king, let alone a single military order. This is where the story takes its remarkable turn. The two greatest rivals in the Holy Land, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, made a calculated decision to co-finance the entire endeavor. Think about the sheer improbability of this. These were organizations that competed for every donation, every parcel of land, every shred of influence. Their rivalry was the defining feature of their relationship, yet here they were, pooling their vast financial resources to create a shared asset. This was not a temporary truce for a single battle. It was a long-term economic partnership, a joint investment in the kingdom's infrastructure. The agreement they forged was likely a complex legal and financial document, outlining exactly how the costs would be split, how the command of the garrison would be shared or rotated, and how any revenues from the lands surrounding the castle would be divided. Imagine the negotiations with Templar and Hospitaller officials sitting across a table, arguing not over strategy or glory, but over accounting ledgers and construction timelines. Their shared goal overrode their competition because the strategic value of Safed was simply too great for either to ignore alone. A completed Safed castle would secure Galilee, threaten Muslim supply lines to Damascus, and provide a safe haven for Christian settlers in the region. It was a project of such immense importance that it transcended their institutional pride. The result of this unprecedented economic collaboration was a masterpiece of military architecture. Safed Castle became a legend, renowned for its immense size and innovative design. It housed a massive garrison and became the administrative center for the entire region, a symbol of Christian power that deterred aggression for decades. The success of Safed demonstrates that the alliances which shaped the Crusades were not always forged on the battlefield. They could be cemented in ledgers and building contracts. This was an alliance of pure, pragmatic investment. It recognized that security was not just about winning battles, but about building and maintaining the formidable infrastructure that made victory possible. The shared fortress at Safed stands as a lasting monument to a simple, powerful truth. When survival is the ultimate goal, even the bitterest rivals can find common cause in pouring their gold into a shared foundation of stone. This move from covert intelligence to overt financial partnership shows the orders adapting their strategies to the demands of a long-term struggle, a flexibility that would be tested in even more unusual diplomatic waters. From the shared investment in formidable castles like Safed, we now turn to a form of diplomacy so shadowy and controversial that it seems to belong more to a spy thriller than to the history of holy wars. This brings us to the most audacious and pragmatically cold alliances of all, the secret diplomatic missions undertaken by both the Templars and the Hospitallers to negotiate with one of the most feared and mysterious organizations of the medieval world, the Order of the Assassins. To understand the sheer boldness of these overtures, you have to grasp how the Assassins were viewed through a European lens. They were not just another Muslim enemy, they were something far more sinister and alien. Known formally as the Nizari Ismailis, this Shia Muslim sect had carved out a series of impregnable mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria. Their power did not come from vast armies, but from a terrifyingly effective strategy of targeted political murder. Their operatives, the Fidai, were fanatically devoted, often willing to die in the act of eliminating a sultan, a vizier, or a powerful general. To the Crusaders, they were the stuff of nightmares, a shadowy brotherhood of heretical killers who could strike at the very heart of power without warning. They were the bogeymen of the Levant, a symbol of treachery and fanaticism. And yet, in the complex political chessboard of the 1270s, both the Templars and the Hospitallers, acting independently and at different times, decided that it was not only necessary but strategically wise to open communications with them. The logic behind this staggering pragmatism was brutally simple. The primary threat to the Crusader states was the rising power of the unified Sunni Muslim forces under leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Saladin. The Nizari assassins, as Shia Muslims, were themselves locked in a bitter, existential struggle with these very same Sunni powers. In the cold calculus of realpolitik, the enemy of my enemy could, at least temporarily, become my contact if not my friend. A non-aggression pact with the assassins would secure the Crusaders' eastern flank, preventing devastating attacks on their castles and pilgrim routes. Even more tantalizing was the possibility of coordinated action, where the assassins could use their unique methods to destabilize the Sunni leadership, creating chaos and division that the Crusader armies could then exploit. Imagine the scene of these clandestine meetings: a Templar envoy, clad in his white mantle marked with the Red Cross, riding high into the Syrian mountains under a flag of truce, escorted to the fortress of Alamat or Masyaf. He would be facing the assassin Grand Master, a figure known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a leader who commanded absolute loyalty through a combination of political cunning and, according to legend, the use of hashish to create visions of paradise for his followers. The negotiations would have been delicate and perilous, conducted through interpreters, with each side weighing the immense benefits against the profound risks. For the military orders, the risk was not just physical but also ideological. They were, after all, soldiers of the Pope, sworn to defend Christendom. To formally treat with a group widely regarded as heretical murderers was a dangerous deviation from their sacred mission, an act that, if made public, could scandalize their patrons in Europe and undermine their moral authority. This is precisely why these missions were conducted in the deepest secrecy, leaving only faint traces in the historical record. The very fact that they happened at all is a testament to the Order's transformation from purely idealistic warriors into shrewd geopolitical players. They were learning to operate in a world where survival depended on understanding and manipulating the complex religious and political fractures within the Muslim world itself. This willingness to engage with the most unlikely of partners for a strategic advantage reveals a level of sophistication that goes far beyond the simplistic image of the Crusader as a blind fanatic. It shows us leaders who are capable of setting aside deep-seated prejudice and fear in pursuit of a larger goal, the continued existence of their fragile kingdoms. This theme of ruthless pragmatism, of alliances forged in the gray areas of morality and faith, finds a powerful echo in a very different part of the world, where the nature of holy war itself was being redefined. While the Crusader orders in the Holy Land were negotiating with assassins and building shared castles, a very different kind of holy war was raging far to the north, in the cold, misty forests and along the frozen coasts of the Baltic Sea. Here, the context was not a defense of ancient Christian kingdoms, but a brutal, expansionist campaign to conquer and convert the last pagan strongholds of Europe. In this harsh frontier, the rules of engagement were different, and the alliances that formed took on a more predatory, territorial character. The Teutonic Order, having established itself as a major power in Prussia, found itself with a neighbor to the northeast, in the land known as Livonia, modern-day Latvia and Estonia. This territory was the domain of a younger, more aggressive order, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Founded just 2 decades after the Teutonics, the Sword Brothers were cut from the same cloth, warrior monks dedicated to the conversion of the Baltic pagans by the sword. But they lacked the Teutonic Order's deep resources, its extensive network of recruitment back in Germany, and its seasoned political acumen. For years, the two orders operated in an uneasy parallel, sometimes cooperating on campaigns, but more often competing for land, souls, and the favor of the Pope. They were rivals on a frontier where the stakes were not just prestige, but survival against fierce and resilient tribes like the Semigallians and the Samogitians. The fragile balance of power in the north was shattered on a September day in 1236 at a place called the Battle of Saul. The Sword Brothers, along with their local allies, marched out to confront a large army of Samogitians and Semigallians. The result was a catastrophe. The Livonian force was surrounded and annihilated. The Grand Master of the Sword Brothers, along with dozens of his knights, was killed on the battlefield. In a single afternoon, the order was decimated, its military power broken, and its very existence thrown into doubt. The surviving Sword Brothers were left leaderless, financially ruined, and facing the very real possibility of being overrun by the emboldened pagan tribes. It was in this moment of profound crisis that the Teutonic Knights saw not just a tragedy, but an unparalleled opportunity. The weakened Sword Brothers were vulnerable, and the Teutonic leadership understood that their lands in Livonia were now up for grabs. Rather than offering a simple alliance of mutual support, the Teutons orchestrated a move of pure, calculated realpolitik. They approached the remnants of the Livonian order not as rescuers, but as absorbers. Behind closed doors, a secret agreement was forged, one that was then presented to and approved by Pope Gregory IX. This was not a merger of equals like two companies joining forces. It was a strategic takeover. The Teutonic Order formally incorporated the Livonian Brotherhood, swallowing it whole. The surviving Livonian Knights were given a choice: assimilate into the Teutonic Order, adopting its rules and accepting its command structure, or face an uncertain future on their own. Most chose assimilation. The lands, castles, and remaining resources of the Sword Brothers were seamlessly transferred to the Teutonic Order. With this single, decisive act, the Teutonic Knights dramatically expanded their territory overnight without having to fight a single new battle for it. They gained control of the entire eastern shore of the Baltic Sea, creating a continuous domain that stretched from Prussia deep into Livonia. This allowed them to coordinate their campaigns against the pagans with far greater efficiency, presenting a unified and overwhelmingly powerful front. The Teutonic-Livonian understanding represents a fundamentally different kind of alliance from those we have seen in the Holy Land. In the Levant, partnerships were typically temporary, born of immediate, shared desperation against a common foe like Saladin. They were pacts of convenience between entities that intended to remain independent once the crisis had passed. In the Baltic, however, the alliance was permanent and structural. It was not about cooperation for a single battle, but about the consolidation of power for long-term expansion. It was an alliance used as a weapon of territorial acquisition, a way to eliminate a rival and absorb its assets to become a regional superpower. This episode shows the Teutonic Order at its most pragmatic and ambitious, acting less like a band of holy warriors and more like a ruthless medieval corporation, leveraging a competitor's failure for its own spectacular growth. This move from a fragile coalition for survival to an aggressive merger for dominance reveals the vast spectrum of forms that Crusader alliances could take, a theme of strategic adaptation that continues as we look at how the orders ensured their very survival after their world collapsed. The catastrophic fall of Acre in 1291 was more than just the loss of a city. It was the final, shattering collapse of the Crusader presence on the mainland. For the Knights Hospitaller, who had invested over 2 centuries in building a network of hospitals, castles, and influence across the Holy Land, it was an existential crisis. They were now an army without a country, a powerful institution suddenly rendered homeless, adrift on the Mediterranean with thousands of brothers, patients, and refugees looking to them for leadership and survival. Their vast estates were overrun. Their primary reason for being the protection and care of pilgrims in Jerusalem was now geographically impossible. In this moment of absolute despair, their future hinged on a single, desperate gamble: finding a new patron who needed what they still possessed in abundance, which was not land but sea power. Their gaze turned to the island of Cyprus, 100 miles off the coast of Syria. The Kingdom of Cyprus, ruled by the Lusignan dynasty, was itself a survivor. It was the last remaining outpost of Crusader rule in the East, a fragile kingdom suddenly inundated with waves of desperate refugees from the fallen mainland. King Henry II of Cyprus faced a dual threat. Externally, the triumphant Mamluk Sultanate, fresh from its victory at Acre, was a looming menace, its fleets growing more powerful by the day. Internally, his kingdom was destabilized by the influx of displaced knights, nobles, and soldiers, all of whom needed to be housed, fed, and somehow integrated into Cypriot society to prevent them from becoming a lawless, discontented force. The Hospitallers arriving on his shores could have been seen as just another burden, but the Order's leadership, demonstrating remarkable strategic foresight, approached the king not as supplicants but as partners. They offered a deal, a pact that was a masterstroke of pragmatic diplomacy. The Hospitallers still commanded a formidable navy, a fleet of war galleys and transport ships that was one of the most experienced in the Mediterranean. They offered this naval power to the Kingdom of Cyprus. In essence, they would become the kingdom's de facto navy, patrolling its waters, protecting its coastlines from Mamluk raids, and securing the vital sea lanes that were Cyprus's lifeline to Europe. In return, they asked for a base, a permanent home from which to operate and reorganize. King Henry, recognizing the immense value of this proposal, agreed. The Hospitallers were granted extensive quarters in the port city of Limassol, where they established their new headquarters. This was not a gift, it was a transaction, an alliance of mutual necessity. For Cyprus, it meant gaining an instant professional naval force without the colossal expense of building one from scratch, a shield against the growing Mamluk threat. For the Hospitallers, it was a lifeline. Limassol became their sanctuary, the place where they could bind their wounds, restructure their command, and plot their future. But this alliance was always a temporary solution, a stepping stone. The Hospitallers were now guests in another king's domain, subject to his laws and his political whims. Their Grand Master was no longer an independent power broker in the Holy Land, but a tenant on a crowded island. They needed a territory they could call their own, a sovereign base where they could be masters of their own destiny once again. Their time on Cyprus, however, was not wasted. It was a period of crucial transformation. They honed their naval skills further, becoming even more adept at the kind of amphibious warfare that would define their future. And from the relative safety of Cyprus, they began to scout for a new, permanent home, their eyes eventually settling on the fertile, strategically located island of Rhodes. The Hospitaller Cypriot Navy Pact, therefore, stands as one of the most vital alliances in the history of the Crusades, not because it won a great battle, but because it prevented a total extinction. It was the ultimate lesson in strategic flexibility. When their original world vanished, the Hospitallers did not stubbornly cling to a lost cause, they adapted. They leveraged their one remaining asset, their naval prowess, to secure a foothold, then used that foothold to launch themselves into a new and even more remarkable chapter. This pact proves that survival in the face of catastrophe is not just about fighting harder, but about thinking smarter and being willing to form the flexible partnerships that allow an institution to live to fight another day. While the desperate pacts in the Holy Land and the strategic mergers in the Baltic were driven by immediate threats to survival, a different kind of alliance was flourishing on the other side of the Mediterranean, one shaped by a centuries-long struggle for an entire peninsula. The fight to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, known as the Reconquista, created a unique environment where the lines between holy war, national expansion, and frontier society were constantly blurred. Here, the military orders that emerged, like the Order of Calatrava and the Order of Santiago, were deeply rooted in the local landscape. their identities forged in the relentless back-and-forth warfare of the Spanish frontier. They were native sons, intimately familiar with the terrain and the tactics of their Moorish adversaries. Yet, even in this localized context, the power of international connection and royal diplomacy would create surprising bridges, linking these Iberian orders with the most famous crusading institution of all, the Knights Templar. The Templars themselves were a transnational force, with a vast network stretching from Scotland to Jerusalem. While their primary focus was the Holy Land, their financial and military resources were so immense that they maintained a significant presence in Iberia, established to protect pilgrim routes to Santiago de Compostela and to participate in the Reconquista, which was seen as a parallel holy war. This created a fascinating dynamic. The local Spanish orders, like Calatrava, founded to defend a crucial fortress gifted by the King of Castile, and Santiago, dedicated to protecting pilgrims, had their own proud traditions and hard-won authority. They could have viewed the arriving Templar contingents as foreign interlopers, wealthy rivals swooping in to claim a share of the glory, and more importantly, the lands reconquered from the Moors. But the kings of the emerging Christian kingdoms, particularly the shrewd rulers of Aragon, saw a greater opportunity. Monarchs like Alfonso I of Aragon, who famously willed his entire kingdom to the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, understood that these international orders brought something invaluable to the fight. Not just seasoned knights, but a steady flow of recruits, funds, and political support from across Europe. A king like James I of Aragon, the Conqueror, became the ultimate catalyst for alliance. He acted as a master diplomat, a shared patron who could command the loyalty of both the local orders and the international Templars. By personally sponsoring major campaigns, such as the epic siege of Valencia, King James could bring these distinct military forces together under his banner. He would assign specific roles based on their strengths. The Templars, with their heavy cavalry and experience in large-scale siege warfare, might form the shock troops for a frontal assault on a city's gates. Simultaneously, the Knights of Calatrava or Santiago, with their superior knowledge of the local geography and experience in the guerrilla-style raids typical of the frontier, could be tasked with scouting, securing the surrounding countryside, and cutting off the enemy's supply lines. This was not a merger born of desperation like the Union at La Forbe, but a calculated, top-down alliance orchestrated by a royal strategist. The king's authority provided the essential glue, suppressing the natural rivalries between the orders by aligning their individual successes with the crown's overarching goal of territorial expansion. A victory at a place like the Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa in 1212, a pivotal moment in the Reconquista, was achieved by a combined Christian force where the various military orders fought alongside secular knights, all coordinated by the Spanish monarchs. For the local orders, cooperation with the Templars under the king's command offered access to greater resources and a connection to the wider crusading movement, enhancing their prestige. For the Templars, it legitimized their presence in Iberia and granted them substantial land grants from the grateful king, expanding their economic empire. This model of alliance, fostered by shared royal patronage, demonstrates a crucial evolution. It shows that cooperation between military orders could be a proactive tool for conquest, not just a reactive measure for defense. It highlights how the ambitions of a powerful secular ruler could successfully bridge the gap between geographically and culturally distinct military brotherhoods, weaving them into a single, more effective instrument of state power. This interplay between royal authority and religious military fervor would find a much quieter, yet equally vital, expression in the day-to-day efforts to protect the very people the Crusades were supposedly fought for, the pilgrims. Amidst the grand strategies of naval blockades and the high-stakes diplomacy with distant kingdoms, it is easy to overlook the fundamental, beating heart of the entire Crusader enterprise, the pilgrim. These were the ordinary men and women who risked everything, traveling thousands of miles from their homes in Europe to walk in the footsteps of Christ. Their safety was the sacred justification for the military order's very existence. Yet, the bitter rivalry between the Templars and Hospitallers often created a dangerous reality on the ground. The roads between the coastal ports like Jaffa and the holy city of Jerusalem were perilous, threatened by bandits, rogue soldiers, and opportunistic raiders. A pilgrim caravan protected by a Templar escort might find its path blocked by a Hospitaller patrol controlling a key bridge or mountain pass, each group suspicious of the other's intentions. In these moments, the very organizations sworn to protect the faithful could inadvertently become the greatest obstacle to their safe passage. It was in response to this untenable situation that some of the most poignant, though fleeting, alliances were formed. During periods of particular tension or heightened external threat, when the routes were especially dangerous, local commanders of both orders would recognize a responsibility that transcended their institutional squabbles. A quiet, unofficial understanding would be reached. A temporary truce, sometimes lasting only for the few days it took a specific caravan to complete its journey, would be brokered. The terms were straightforward. The Templars and Hospitallers would agree to suspend all hostilities and post their knights along a designated section of the road. They would establish a coordinated security corridor, with Templar outposts and Hospitaller garrisons communicating to ensure a seamless, safe passage. A pilgrim group leaving Templar-protected territory would be met by a Hospitaller escort at an agreed-upon point, who would then guide them through their zone of control without harassment or demands for additional tolls. These agreements were never celebrated with grand ceremonies or recorded in chronicles. They were practical, administrative arrangements made by commanders on the front lines who understood the human cost of their feud. The significance of these temporary truces, however, is profound. They strip away the layers of politics and power to reveal a core, shared purpose that had not been entirely extinguished by competition. For a few days at a time, the Red Cross of the Templars and the White Cross of the Hospitallers were not symbols of rivalry, but complementary parts of a single protective shield. This was an alliance driven not by the cold calculus of realpolitik, but by a reaffirmation of their original, foundational mission. It proved that beneath the ambition and the pride, there remained a flicker of their initial vow to serve the pilgrims. This ability to momentarily revert to their core identity, to prioritize the safety of the vulnerable over their own institutional advantage, speaks to a complexity often missing from their story. It shows that their motivations were not monolithic. They were a constant internal tug of war between earthly power and sacred duty. On the dusty roads to Jerusalem, duty could still, on occasion, win. This quiet, humane cooperation stands in stark contrast to the alliances forged for conquest, reminding us that even in a world defined by conflict, a shared higher purpose could still bridge the deepest divides, a theme of underlying unity that finds a different expression in the unexpected collaboration that happened not on the battlefield, but in the hospital ward. Beyond the clash of swords and the grand strategies of kings, another, quieter form of cooperation was taking place, one that operated in the hushed halls of hospitals and the scriptoriums where medical texts were copied. This was the unofficial, yet profoundly important, collaboration on medical knowledge between the Templars and the Hospitallers. While they competed fiercely for land and influence, they found a common cause in a battle against a far more relentless enemy, disease and injury. The Hospitallers, true to their name, were the undisputed masters of medieval medicine in the Levant. Their great hospital in Jerusalem was a marvel of its time, a vast institution capable of housing thousands of patients, renowned for its cleanliness, order, and advanced treatments. They had accumulated centuries of practical experience, learning how to treat everything from battlefield wounds and fractures to the fevers and dysentery that routinely ravaged armies. They employed skilled surgeons, apothecaries who prepared complex remedies using herbs from both Europe and the East, and they even maintained facilities for the mentally ill, a level of care almost unheard of elsewhere. The Templars, on the other hand, possessed a different kind of strength. Their network of commanderies stretched like a web across the Crusader states and back along the pilgrim routes to Europe. These were not just military outposts, they were way stations, banks, and communication hubs. This meant that Templar brothers were constantly on the move, exposed to a wide variety of illnesses and injuries across different climates and regions. They became, by necessity, keen observers of health and disease, and their far-flung network acted as a de facto information highway. An informal, unspoken understanding developed between the two orders. If a Templar knight was gravely wounded in a skirmish far from his own order's facilities, and a Hospitaller infirmary was the closest place of refuge, he would be admitted without question. The Hospitallers, bound by their core mission of charity, would provide the same high standard of care they offered their own brothers. In return, the Templars' extensive travels allowed them to gather and disseminate medical knowledge. A Templar sergeant traveling from a remote castle in Antioch might bring news of a local remedy for a particular fever that was proving effective. A Hospitaller apothecary, in turn, might share a new technique for stitching wounds that reduced the risk of infection, knowledge that would then be carried by Templar messengers to garrisons across the land. This exchange was not governed by a formal treaty, but by a shared, pragmatic need to keep their fighting men in the field. A healthy knight was a valuable asset, regardless of which cross he wore on his tunic. This collaboration represented a fascinating separation of the spiritual from the practical. They could be rivals in the council chamber and on the parade ground, but in the hospital ward, a different code prevailed, the code of healing. This silent partnership saved countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to infection or inadequate care. It also led to a gradual improvement in medical practice for both orders. The Hospitallers' theoretical knowledge was tempered and expanded by the practical field reports coming from the Templars' widespread experiences. Conversely, Templar preceptories, which maintained their own smaller infirmaries, began to adopt the more systematic and hygienic practices pioneered by the Hospitallers. This alliance of science and compassion highlights a layer of Crusader life that is often forgotten. It shows that beneath the surface of political and military rivalry, there existed a foundational layer of shared humanity and a mutual interest in survival. The well-being of their members was a goal so fundamental that it could, even temporarily, erase the lines of competition, creating a subtle network of care that was every bit as strategic as any military pact. While the grand alliances that decided the fate of cities and turned the tide of entire campaigns capture the historical imagination, the day-to-day survival of the Crusader states often hinged on a much quieter, more persistent form of cooperation. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rugged, disputed hinterlands of the Principality of Antioch. Perched on the northeastern corner of the Crusader world, Antioch was a realm perpetually on a knife's edge. Its glorious ancient city was one thing, but its lifeblood, the farmlands, villages, and vital trade routes that extended into the surrounding countryside, was constantly exposed. This was a landscape of narrow mountain passes, deep valleys, and lonely roads, a perfect hunting ground for bandits, opportunistic Turkoman raiders, and the scouts of nearby Muslim powers. Securing this vast, open territory was an impossible task for the Prince of Antioch's limited-standing army. The defense of the frontier fell, by necessity, to the military orders who had built their castles along the border. And here, in the dusty, sun-baked valleys of the Amanus Mountains, the Templars and Hospitallers, for all their rivalry in the royal court, became reluctant partners in a tedious, unglamorous, but absolutely essential war of attrition. This was not an alliance proclaimed with trumpets or celebrated in chronicles. It was a practical, ground-level understanding forged between the Castellans, the local commanders of neighboring Templar and Hospitaller strongholds. These men, living in their isolated fortresses, faced the same daily threats. They understood that their individual security was an illusion if the territory between them was lawless. A raiding party that slipped past a Templar watchtower could easily strike a village under Hospitaller protection, and vice versa. Their competition for prestige in Jerusalem mattered little when the harvest that fed their garrisons was at risk of being burned just a few miles away. So they developed a system of coordinated defense, a series of informal garrison agreements that functioned with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The core of this alliance was the shared patrol. Instead of each order patrolling only the immediate vicinity of their own castle, they established a schedule. Templar Knights would ride patrols that extended into zones nominally under Hospitaller watch, and Hospitaller sergeants would do the same, covering approaches to Templar-held lands. This created a continuous, overlapping web of surveillance that made it far more difficult for raiders to move undetected. They also established shared lookout points on high ground, where a signal fire lit by a Templar sentry would be seen and answered by a Hospitaller garrison miles away, allowing for a rapid, combined response to any incursion. Perhaps the most ingenious aspect of this cooperation was the rotation of garrison duties for smaller, more vulnerable outposts. A remote watchtower guarding a critical mountain pass might be too costly for a single order to maintain year-round. Under their agreement, the Templars would station a contingent of men there for 6 months, after which the Hospitallers would send a relief force to take over the watch, allowing the first group to return to their main castle for rest and resupply. This shared burden ensured that these vital strategic points were never left undefended due to fatigue or a lack of manpower. This localized alliance had a profound impact on the lives of the ordinary people who made the Principality of Antioch function. For the Christian and Armenian farmers tending their fields, the sight of a mixed patrol, a knight in a white mantle with a red cross riding alongside one in a black tunic with a white cross, was a tangible sign of security. It meant their crops might survive to harvest, their families could travel to market with a measure of safety, and the slow, steady work of building a life in the Holy Land could continue. This was the Crusade stripped of its epic scale, reduced to its most fundamental level: the protection of the hearth and the highway. The joint defense of Antioch's hinterland demonstrates that the most enduring alliances are not always those formed in moments of epic crisis, but rather those built on the shared, mundane necessities of daily existence. It reveals a level of military professionalism and pragmatic adaptation that often goes unnoticed. These knights were not just holy warriors, they were the sheriffs of a dangerous frontier, and their ability to cooperate on the ground, despite the disputes of their high commanders, was what kept the fragile flame of the Crusader states flickering in a very dark and windy corner of the world. This focus on the practical economics of security, on managing the assets of war, leads us directly to our next example, where cooperation was driven not by shared patrols, but by a shared appetite for the spoils of victory. While the quiet cooperation in Antioch's hinterland was about shared responsibility for defense, the next alliance we uncover reveals a far more calculating side of the military orders, one driven not by a sense of duty, but by the cold, hard logic of profit. The scene shifts to the banks of the Nile Delta in the year 1218, where the armies of the Fifth Crusade were bogged down in a grueling siege of the Egyptian city of Damietta. This was a campaign of immense scale and ambition, aimed at striking a decisive blow against the powerful Ayyubid Sultanate by capturing a key Egyptian port. But as the siege dragged on for month after miserable month, a different kind of battle began to brew within the Crusader camp itself. The sheer potential wealth locked inside Damietta's walls was staggering. The city was a major commercial hub, its warehouses filled with spices, silks, and precious metals, and its wealthy citizens possessed fortunes in gold and jewels. For any army in the Middle Ages, the prospect of such plunder was a powerful motivator, but it was also a recipe for disaster. History was littered with examples of Crusader victories turning into chaotic free-for-alls, where the hard-won discipline of a siege collapsed into a frenzy of looting as rival factions turned on each other, fighting over the spoils instead of securing the conquest. The leaders of the three major military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, were all too aware of this dangerous precedent. They knew that the moment Damietta's walls were breached, their own knights, along with the secular nobles and common soldiers, would be tempted to grab whatever they could. Such chaos could easily allow a determined enemy counterattack to succeed, or it could shatter the fragile coalition of the Crusade as French knights brawled with Italians, and the military orders clashed with each other over a particularly rich mosque or merchant's house. The very success of the entire campaign hung in the balance, so, in a remarkable act of foresight, the high command of the three orders did something profoundly pragmatic. Before the final assault had even begun, they sat down together and negotiated a detailed, binding agreement on exactly how the plunder of Damietta would be divided. This was not a gentleman's agreement. It was a formal contract, likely specifying percentages of the total loot or assigning specific districts of the city to each order. They were essentially creating a corporate merger for the purpose of asset acquisition. The Templars, with their vast logistical experience, probably took the lead in drafting the terms, ensuring that the division was seen as fair, or at least acceptable to all parties. The brilliance of this pre-negotiated pact was that it removed the primary cause of post-victory conflict before the victory even happened. When the Crusaders finally stormed the city, the knights of each order knew exactly what they were fighting for and what they could expect to receive. There was no need to race ahead of allies to seize the best prizes, because the prizes had already been allocated by treaty. This allowed the assault to maintain its military objective, securing the city. The knights could focus on neutralizing the remaining defenders and establishing control over key strongpoints, rather than scattering in a dozen different directions in a greedy dash for treasure. The orderly capture of Damietta, facilitated by this alliance of greed, was a significant, if ultimately temporary, success for the Fifth Crusade. It demonstrated a level of organizational sophistication that went far beyond simple martial prowess. The military orders were acting not just as warriors, but as the administrators of warfare, understanding that managing human nature, especially the powerful desire for wealth, was just as critical to victory as breaking down a city's walls. This alliance was arguably one of the most cynical we have examined. It was not forged in a moment of shared desperation against a common foe, like at La Fourbe, nor was it inspired by a higher purpose like protecting pilgrims. It was a cold-blooded business deal, an agreement designed to maximize profit and minimize internal conflict, and yet its effectiveness cannot be denied. By openly acknowledging and planning for the baser motivations of their soldiers, the leaders of the orders ensured that short-sighted greed did not undermine their long-term strategic goal. This starkly pragmatic approach to cooperation, where even avarice could be harnessed as a tool for success, shows just how far these holy warriors would go to secure a victory, a mindset that would soon lead them into even darker and more shadowy forms of partnership. As the 13th century drew to a close, the balance of power in the Near East underwent a seismic and seemingly irreversible shift. The Mamluk Sultanate, a regime built by slave soldiers who had seized control of Egypt, emerged as an unstoppable military juggernaut. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the Mamluks had effectively erased the Crusader states from the map, their armies demonstrating a discipline and ferocity that the fractured Latin forces could not match. For the surviving military orders, now based in Cyprus or desperately holding onto a few coastal strongholds, the prospect of a direct, head-on confrontation with the Mamluk war machine was tantamount to suicide. The era of the great set-piece battles was over. In its place, a new, far more shadowy kind of conflict began, one fought not with banners flying and trumpets sounding, but with whispered conversations, bags of gold coin, and crates of weapons delivered under cover of darkness. This was the birth of a clandestine strategy, a desperate attempt to wage a war by proxy. Faced with an enemy they could not defeat in open combat, the military orders, particularly the Hospitallers from their new base on Cyprus, began to explore a dangerous and morally ambiguous path. They started to provide secret support to the various dissident groups and rebellious factions that simmered within the vast territories of the Mamluk Sultanate. The logic was brutally pragmatic. The Mamluks, for all their power, ruled over a diverse and often restive empire, encompassing Egyptians, Syrians, Bedouin tribes, and remnants of the old Ayyubid aristocracy. These groups did not always welcome Mamluk domination. Local rebellions and tribal uprisings were a constant, low-grade threat to the Sultanate's stability. For the Crusaders, these internal conflicts were not just someone else's problem, they were a potential lifeline. By discreetly funneling money, weapons, and even military advisors to these rebel groups, the military orders could effectively outsource their fighting. They could keep the Mamluk armies tied down, forcing them to deal with internal brushfires instead of launching new invasions against the last Christian outposts. A rebellion in the Syrian hinterland, for example, meant that Mamluk troops stationed on the coast had to be redeployed inland, relieving pressure on the Hospitaller positions. This covert campaign required a completely different set of skills than those of a knight on horseback. It demanded a network of trusted agents, often local Christians, Armenian merchants, or even disaffected Muslims who could move unseen through Mamluk territory. These intermediaries would make contact with rebel leaders, offering support in exchange for a promise to intensify their activities against the Sultanate. The assistance was carefully deniable. A shipment of swords and crossbow bolts might be landed on a remote beach at night. A chest of gold dinars, enough to pay a rebel army for months, would be transferred in the back room of a seemingly neutral trading house in a port like Alexandria. The orders were not under any illusion that these rebel groups were their friends or shared their goals. They were often supporting factions whose own ambitions were unclear and whose loyalty was fleeting. It was an alliance of pure, unvarnished convenience. The rebels gained the resources they needed to challenge their Mamluk overlords, and the Crusaders gained a strategic distraction, a way to weaken their primary enemy without risking their own dwindling manpower. This strategy represents one of the most sophisticated and cynical evolutions in Crusader statecraft. It was a clear recognition that their own power was no longer sufficient, and that influence could be exerted indirectly. They were engaging in what we would now call proxy warfare, a concept far ahead of its time. This shadowy game was incredibly risky. If discovered, it would provide the Mamluks with a perfect pretext for launching a final, crushing attack on the Crusader refuges in Cyprus. It also raised profound moral questions for organizations founded on religious principles. Were they justified in arming groups whose own actions might be equally brutal, simply because they opposed a common foe? The secret support for anti-Mamluk rebellions forces us to see the final chapter of the Crusades not as a simple story of decline and fall, but as a complex twilight struggle where diplomacy and subversion became the last, best weapons against overwhelming force. This move into the shadows, where allies were temporary and motives were murky, stands in stark contrast to a very different kind of partnership, one that unfolded not in the heart of the Muslim world, but on the remote, forested frontiers of Eastern Europe. While the grand orders like the Templars and Hospitallers dominated the landscape of the Holy Land, their influence was not confined to the Mediterranean coast. Their networks of communication and finance stretched across the entire continent, creating opportunities for influence in regions far from their primary theaters of war. This brings us to a fascinating, long-distance alliance that operated on the remote, forested frontier of Eastern Europe, a world away from the sun-baked hills of Palestine. Here, the mighty Templars engaged in a form of international patronage, forming a patron-client relationship with a small, local order fighting for its very survival. The stage for this collaboration was the windswept plains and dense woodlands of Masovia, a region in northeastern Poland. In the early 13th century, this area was the volatile borderland between the expanding Christian kingdom of Poland and the territories of the fierce, pagan Prussian and Baltic tribes. For the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia, this frontier was a constant source of anxiety. His lands were subjected to relentless raids from these tribes, who would strike without warning, plundering villages and taking captives before melting back into the impenetrable forest. Duke Conrad's own forces were stretched thin, and he desperately needed a dedicated, permanent military force to secure his borders and push back against the pagan threat. His solution was to create a new, local military order specifically tasked with this mission. Thus, around 1228, the Knightly Order of Dobrin was born. Also known as the Brothers of Dobrin, these knights were given a clear and daunting mandate to defend Masovia and wage a holy war against the Prussian pagans. They were granted a charter and a base, the Castle of Dobrin, from which they would operate, but from the very beginning the Order of Dobrin faced immense challenges. They were a new and small organization, lacking the centuries of tradition, the vast European estates, and the deep pools of recruits and funding that the Templars or Teutonic Knights could draw upon. They were essentially a local militia with noble aspirations, trying to stand against battle-hardened tribal warriors on their own turf. It was in this context of struggle that the long arm of the Templar Order reached out from the south. The Templars themselves had a limited direct presence in Poland, perhaps maintaining a small preceptory or two, but their intelligence network would have kept them well informed about the situation on the Prussian frontier. They recognized an opportunity. By offering support to the fledgling Order of Dobrin, the Templars could extend their influence into a new region without committing their own valuable knights and resources to a secondary theater of war. This was not an alliance of equals marching side by side. It was a relationship of benefactor and beneficiary. the Templars provided two crucial forms of assistance: military expertise and financial capital. They would occasionally send experienced military advisors, veteran sergeants or knights who had fought in the Holy Land, to counsel the Brothers of Dobrin on strategy, fortification, and tactics. For a local order accustomed to the chaotic skirmishes of the frontier, the advice of a commander who had participated in the great sieges of the Levant would have been invaluable. Furthermore, the Templars, acting as the medieval equivalent of an international bank, provided financial loans to the Order of Dobrin. These loans would have been essential for funding the construction of border fortifications, purchasing arms and armor, and maintaining a standing force of knights in the field. In return, the Templars gained a client state, a friendly order on a dangerous frontier that owed them a debt of gratitude and likely money. This allowed them to project soft power deep into Eastern Europe, enhancing their prestige and creating a strategic relationship that could be leveraged in the future. The collaboration was a pragmatic arrangement for both parties. For the Order of Dobrin, it was a lifeline, a connection to the wealth and wisdom of the broader crusading movement that increased their chances of survival. For the Templars, it was a low-cost, high-yield investment in geopolitical influence. This patron-client model shows the Templars thinking like a multinational corporation, using their vast resources to establish footholds and alliances far from their core operations. It demonstrates that their power was not merely military, but also financial and diplomatic, capable of shaping events on frontiers they would never personally fight on. The story of the Order of Dobrin itself, however, would soon be overshadowed by the arrival of a much more powerful player in the region, the Teutonic Knights, who would ultimately absorb the smaller order. But for a brief, critical period, the support of the Templars provided a crucial buffer, illustrating yet another versatile form that Crusader alliances could take. The fall of the Holy Land had redrawn the map of power in the eastern Mediterranean, leaving former adversaries adrift in a new and uncertain sea. For the Knights Hospitaller, finding a new home on the island of Rhodes was a masterstroke, but it came with a fresh set of challenges. They were no longer land-based castellans defending a static frontier. They had transformed into a naval power, their survival now dependent on their ability to command the waves. And the waters surrounding their new island fortress were anything but peaceful. The Aegean Sea had become a hunting ground for a new and pervasive threat: Turkish pirates and corsairs operating from the burgeoning emirates along the Anatolian coast. These were not the organized fleets of a sultan, but agile, predatory bands that preyed on the lifeblood of the region, its maritime trade. For the Hospitallers, whose economy on Rhodes relied heavily on controlling and taxing the very shipping lanes now under threat, this pirate scourge was an existential problem. It was in this context of shared vulnerability that one of the most pragmatically straightforward alliances of the era was born: an understanding between the Hospitallers and an empire that was itself a shadow of its former glory, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, with their capital at Constantinople, still viewed themselves as the heirs to Rome, but their control over the Aegean was tenuous. Their archipelago of islands and their own merchant vessels were just as vulnerable to the Turkish corsairs as anyone else's. The ancient theological and political animosities that had defined the relationship between Constantinople and the Latin West, the memory of the sacked city during the Fourth Crusade, all of that still simmered beneath the surface. Yet on the deck of a galley in the open sea, such grand historical grievances suddenly felt abstract. The immediate, shared danger created a common ground that dogma could not erase. A Turkish pirate ship did not distinguish between a Byzantine merchantman carrying grain and a Hospitaller vessel transporting timber. Both were equally valuable targets. This mutual need for security gave rise to an operational-level alliance that was remarkable for its simplicity. There was no grand treaty signed with great ceremony, no exchange of lofty embassies. Instead, it was likely forged through direct communication between the Hospitaller admiral on Rhodes and the Byzantine strategos, or military governor, of a nearby province like the theme of the Aegean Sea. The agreement was purely functional, a coordination of patrols. A Hospitaller war galley, with its distinctive black hull and white cross sail, might agree to extend its patrol route to cover a stretch of coastline nominally under Byzantine control. In return, a squadron of lighter Byzantine dromons would keep a watchful eye on the sea lanes approaching Rhodes, sharing sightings of suspicious vessels through simple flag signals or fast-sailing messenger boats. This was not a joint command. Each force remained under its own officers, operating within its own chain of command. The cooperation was based on a shared recognition of a common enemy and a mutual interest in keeping the sea lanes open for commerce. The brilliance of this arrangement lay in its limited scope. It did not require either party to forgive past wrongs or to agree on points of theology. It asked only that they act in their own immediate self-interest, which, in this specific circumstance, happened to align perfectly with the interests of the other. For a few days at a time, in a designated sector of the Aegean, the cross of the Hospitaller and the double-headed eagle of Byzantium were not symbols of division, but complementary components of a regional security system. This alliance highlights a critical truth about the post-Crusade world. Survival increasingly depended on such flexible, limited partnerships. It demonstrated that even the deepest historical enmities could be set aside when faced with a threat to economic survival. The Hospitaller-Byzantine naval patrols were a testament to the power of pure pragmatism, a quiet acknowledgement that on the unpredictable sea, the most important alliance was often the one that kept your trade routes safe and your people fed, a lesson in realpolitik that would find a powerful echo in the intelligence networks of a different Christian kingdom struggling for survival. Far from the familiar shores of the Mediterranean, the Teutonic Order carved out a unique and perilous position for itself in a kingdom known as Lesser Armenia, or the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. While the Templars and Hospitallers were fixtures in Jerusalem and Acre, the Teutonic Knights had accepted land grants from the Armenian rulers, establishing a presence in this Christian kingdom nestled in the rugged Taurus mountains of what is now southern Turkey. But this was no quiet provincial posting. Lesser Armenia existed in a geopolitical pressure cooker, squeezed between three immense and often hostile powers: the Byzantine Empire to the west, the rising Mamluk Sultanate to the south, and most terrifyingly, the seemingly unstoppable Mongol Empire to the east. Survival here was not about glorious crusades. It was a daily exercise in reading the winds of impending disaster. It was in this environment of constant, looming threat that the Teutonic Order and the Armenian nobility forged one of the most vital, though least celebrated, alliances of the era, a sophisticated intelligence-sharing network that functioned as a regional early warning system. This partnership was born from a cold, mutual calculation. Both the Teutonic Knights as a foreign military order and the native Armenian barons were acutely aware of their shared vulnerability. They were small fish in a sea of sharks, and their only hope of avoiding being swallowed whole was to see the sharks coming long before they arrived. The Armenians possessed an invaluable asset: generations of experience navigating the complex politics of the region. Their merchants traveled deep into Mongol-controlled Persia and Mamluk-held Syria. Their diplomats maintained contacts in countless courts, and their mountain tribesmen knew every pass and valley, making them unparalleled sources of local gossip and hard intelligence. The Teutonic Order, in turn, offered something the Armenians lacked: a highly organized international communication network. A Teutonic brother riding from their Armenian preceptory could carry a message with the Order's authority to outposts in Cyprus, Venice, or even back to their headquarters in Prussia. Their commanderies functioned as relay stations for information, creating a swift and reliable pipeline to the wider world. This exchange was a perfect marriage of local knowledge and global reach. An Armenian scout observing the mustering of a Mamluk army near Aleppo would report this to his local lord, who would then pass the warning to the Teutonic Castellan. The Teutonic Knights would immediately dispatch a rider to the coast, where one of their ships could carry the news to the Pope and the monarchs of Europe, potentially triggering a new crusade or at least bringing reinforcements. Conversely, if the Teutonic Order received word from its agents in Italy about a large fleet being prepared in Egypt, that intelligence was priceless for the Armenian king, giving him precious weeks to fortify his mountain passes and call his levies to arms. The most critical intelligence they shared concerned the movements of the Mongols. This new, apocalyptic force from the steppes was an unknown quantity, capable of wiping out entire kingdoms in a single campaign. For both the Armenians and the Teutons, understanding the intentions of the Mongol Ilkhanate was a matter of life and death. Was a particular Mongol general marching west to attack the Mamluks, which might be good news, or was he turning north toward Armenian lands? A rumor, confirmed by a Teutonic source with contacts in the Mongol court, could allow the Armenian kingdom to swear fealty in time to avoid destruction or to prepare for a desperate defense. This was not an alliance of convenience for a single battle. It was a continuous, institutionalized partnership for survival. It recognized that in a world of superpowers, information was the most valuable currency. A few days' warning could mean the difference between a city successfully withstanding a siege and being put to the sword. This deep, symbiotic relationship between the Teutonic Order and the Kingdom of Lesser Armenia demonstrates a level of strategic integration that went far beyond simple mercenary service. The Teutons were not just landholders, they had become an essential component of the kingdom's nervous system, its eyes and ears reaching far beyond its mountainous borders. This pragmatic fusion of local and international intelligence networks underscores a fundamental truth of the later Crusader period, that the most successful entities were those that could best understand and adapt to the complex, terrifying world forming around them, a theme of desperate diplomacy that reached its zenith in the next, and perhaps most ambitious, alliance we will explore. The staggering rise of the Mongol Empire presented the fractured powers of the 13th century with a terrifying dilemma, a force so vast and alien that it defied all previous understanding of warfare and diplomacy. For the Crusader states clinging to their narrow strip of coastline, this new power from the east was at first just another cataclysm, a storm that had annihilated their Muslim enemies but seemed certain to sweep them away as well. Yet from the chaos and the fear, a breathtakingly ambitious idea began to take shape in the minds of popes and kings in far-off Europe. What if this unstoppable horde, this scourge of the Muslim world, could be persuaded not to destroy the last Christian outposts in the Holy Land, but to join them? What if the Mongols could be turned into allies against the common and ever-growing threat of the Mamluk Sultanate? This radical notion, born of sheer desperation, led to one of the most extraordinary and ill-fated chapters in Crusader diplomacy, a series of joint embassies that saw sworn rivals from the military orders traveling together to the ends of the known world. These were not minor diplomatic feelers, they were grand, perilous undertakings. Popes like Innocent IV and monarchs like Louis IX of France sponsored these missions, sending envoys on journeys that would last for years across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain into the heart of the Mongol Ilkhanate. The very composition of these embassies was a marvel in itself. Under normal circumstances, the idea of a high-ranking Templar legate, a Hospitaller commander, and perhaps an envoy from the Teutonic Order sharing a cramped tent for months on end would have been unthinkable. Their orders were competitors, their leadership often at odds over strategy and resources. Yet the scale of the potential prize, a military alliance with the most powerful empire on earth, was so immense that it forced a temporary suspension of their ingrained rivalries. For the duration of these epic journeys, they were not Templars or Hospitallers first. They were representatives of a broader, if fragile, Christian interest. Imagine the scene: a small caravan of European knights and clerics, their distinctive Western armor and vestments looking increasingly out of place as they journeyed east, across the vastness of the Ukrainian steppe, through the Caucasus Mountains, and into the domains of the Ilkhanate in Persia. Their travels were a lesson in humility, exposing them to the sheer scale and sophistication of the Mongol world, a realm that made the kingdoms of Europe seem provincial and small. The negotiations themselves were a clash of cultures on a grand scale. The European envoys, including the brothers from the military orders, arrived with a specific and, to their minds, reasonable proposition. They spoke of a shared enemy, the Mamluks of Egypt, and proposed a classic military pact, a great pincer movement where the Mongol armies would attack the Mamluks from the east while the Crusader forces, perhaps reinforced by a new wave of knights from Europe, would strike from the west. They often framed this in religious terms, suggesting that the Mongol Khans should consider baptism and join the fold of Christendom. The Mongol response, typically delivered by a powerful Khan like Gayak or later Hulagu, was usually a study in bewildering condescension. From the Mongol perspective, they were the masters of the world, appointed by the eternal blue sky to rule over all peoples. The idea of an alliance between equals was nonsensical to them. Instead, they would present the European envoys with a standard demand: the unconditional submission of all the kings of Europe to the Great Khan. They saw the Pope and the monarchs not as potential partners, but as distant chieftains who had yet to acknowledge their proper overlord. The letters they sent back with the envoys were stark, commanding the Pope and all European rulers to travel to the Mongol court personally to swear fealty. For the knights from the military orders, men accustomed to a certain degree of respect and authority, these audiences must have been profoundly disorienting. They were there to negotiate a treaty but found themselves being treated as tributaries. Despite this fundamental disconnect, the missions were not complete failures. They provided the West with its first detailed, first-hand intelligence about the Mongols, their customs, their military tactics, and the internal politics of their empire. The envoys learned, for instance, that the Mongols were remarkably tolerant in matters of religion, and that many within the Ilkhanate, including some of the Khan's own wives, were Nestorian Christians. This kept the flicker of hope alive for decades. The most tantalizing moment came later in the century, when the Ilkhanate itself, under rulers like Abaka Khan, genuinely sought a military alliance with the West against their Mamluk rivals. But by then, the Crusader states were too weak to be a meaningful partner, and Europe's attention had wandered. The great project of a Mongol Crusader alliance ultimately faded away. Yet, the image of those joint embassies remains powerful. They represent a fleeting moment of supreme ambition and unity among the crusading orders, a time when they dared to look beyond their immediate squabbles and imagine a geopolitical realignment that could have saved their world. It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble, a diplomatic Hail Mary pass that, while it never found its target, stands as a testament to the sheer scale of their strategic imagination in the face of impending doom. Beyond the clash of armies and the grand strategies of kings, the daily reality for a knight in the Holy Land was fraught with a more personal danger: the ever-present risk of capture. To be taken prisoner was not merely a temporary inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence or worse, a life of slavery in a distant quarry or galley. For the military orders whose strength lay in their highly trained professional brotherhoods, the loss of even a single seasoned knight was a significant blow. These men were not easily replaced, they were the product of years of training and combat experience, the institutional memory of a century of warfare. It was this cold, practical calculation that gave rise to one of the most humane and quietly effective alliances of the entire era, an informal but deeply understood agreement on the ransoming of captured knights. This was not a pact signed with seals and ceremonies, but a code of conduct woven into the very fabric of their shared existence, an unspoken promise that transcended their fierce institutional rivalries. Imagine a Templar patrol ambushed in the rocky hills of Galilee. A young sergeant separated from his brothers is surrounded and disarmed, his fate now hanging in the balance. His captors, knowing his value, would not simply execute him. A living knight was a valuable commodity, worth a substantial ransom in gold dinars. The news of his capture would eventually reach the nearest Templar commandery, but the local commander might not have the vast sum required immediately available in his coffers. The ransom demand could be crippling. This is where the silent alliance would activate. The Templar commander would send discreet word to his counterpart in the nearest Hospitaller fortress. Despite their competition, the Hospitaller Ascalon would understand the situation perfectly. He knew that tomorrow it could be one of his own brothers languishing in a Muslim dungeon. An informal but reliable system emerged. A Hospitaller house might contribute a portion of the ransom money, effectively loaning it to the Templars with an understanding that the favor would be returned. In some cases, if the Templars were gathering the ransom for a particularly high-ranking knight, the Hospitallers might even help negotiate with the captors, using their own networks of contacts and translators to secure a better price or ensure the knight's humane treatment while in captivity. This system functioned because it was rooted in a shared sense of chivalric obligation that overrode their earthly disputes. They were, at their core, brothers in a holy war, even if they were brothers from rival households. The safe return of a skilled warrior benefited the entire Crusader cause, strengthening the defensive capabilities of the Latin East as a whole. A ransomed Templar knight, once freed, would return to the fight, his experience and loyalty intact. This was far preferable to the alternative, where he would be lost forever, his value transferred to an enemy's treasury. This mutual support network reveals a fascinating layer of pragmatism beneath the surface of their rivalry. It was an acknowledgement that their competition was ultimately a family quarrel, and that when a member of the wider crusading family was in mortal peril, solidarity had to take precedence. This alliance of chivalric obligation ensured that the military orders did not bleed themselves dry through the slow, steady drain of captured warriors. It was a financial and moral safety net that recognized their shared vulnerability and their common purpose, a subtle thread of cooperation that helped bind the fragile fabric of the Crusader states together against overwhelming odds. While the clandestine efforts to ransom captured knights reveal a shared commitment to preserving human capital, another, even more fundamental form of cooperation was taking place, one that literally charted the course for all their operations. In an age without satellites or GPS, knowledge of the land and sea was a form of power as potent as any castle or army. The military orders, through their constant movement of men, supplies, and messages across thousands of miles, became accidental masters of geography. Each order, through its unique network of commanderies and the relentless travels of its brothers, accumulated a treasure trove of practical, first-hand knowledge about the world. A Templar sergeant riding from Paris to Acre would note the safest mountain passes, the most reliable fords across rivers, and the towns friendly to their cause. A Hospitaller ship captain sailing from Marseille to Cyprus would meticulously record the prevailing winds, the hidden coves that offered shelter from a storm, and the dangerous reefs that could tear the hull out of a vessel. This information was not just academic, it was the lifeblood of their existence, determining the speed of their communications, the safety of their supply lines, and the success of their military campaigns. Yet this knowledge was inherently fragmented. The Templars, with their strongholds along the pilgrim routes, had an unparalleled understanding of the overland trails of Europe and the Levant. The Hospitallers, especially after their move to Rhodes, developed an expert knowledge of the intricate sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. The Teutonic Knights possessed detailed charts of the Baltic coast and the river systems of Eastern Europe. For any single order to operate at peak efficiency, it needed access to this collective intelligence. This necessity gave rise to a quiet, unofficial exchange of maps and sailing charts, an alliance of cartography that operated in the scriptoriums and captains' cabins of the Crusader world. This was not a formal library where orders openly shared their secrets. Instead, it was a pragmatic exchange among professionals who recognized a mutual interest in survival. Imagine a Hospitaller admiral planning a naval patrol from Rhodes to the coast of Armenia, consulting a chart that had been discreetly copied from a Templar original, its annotations detailing currents and anchorages known only to their rivals. Or a Teutonic Knight tasked with leading a contingent from Venice to Acre, being provided with a Hospitaller-drawn map of the Dalmatian coast, indicating which ports offered the best fresh water and supplies. This collaboration transformed individual fragments of knowledge into a more complete picture of the world. A Templar map of the road from Antioch to Jerusalem, noting the locations of secure wells, could be combined with a Hospitaller chart of the same region's coastline, allowing for coordinated land and sea operations. This shared cartographic understanding made navigation dramatically safer and more efficient for everyone. A ship captain could avoid a known area of piracy, a land commander could choose a route that maximized secrecy and speed, and a messenger could find the shortest path between two distant castles. This alliance of information highlights a sophisticated understanding of logistics that went far beyond simple military might. It shows the Order's thinking like a modern intelligence agency, recognizing that data is a strategic asset. By pooling their geographical knowledge, they were not just helping each other, they were building a collective advantage that made the entire Crusader enterprise more resilient. The lines they drew on parchment were as vital to their operations as the lines of their battle formations, a silent partnership in knowledge that guided every journey and underpinned every campaign. While the quiet exchange of maps and the shared efforts to ransom knights demonstrated a deep, underlying layer of cooperation, there were moments when this collaborative spirit was forced into the open and tested on a grand public scale. One such moment arrived with the Barons' Crusade, a campaign that, while often overshadowed by its more famous predecessors, provides a perfect case study of how a strong, unifying leader could momentarily weld the rival military orders into a single, devastatingly effective instrument of war. The Crusade was led by Theobald I, the wealthy and politically astute King of Navarre and Count of Champagne. Unlike some crusading monarchs who arrived with dreams of glorious conquest, Theobald was a pragmatist. He understood the fractured political and military landscape of the Latin East all too well. He knew that landing with his own army of French knights and then trying to coordinate with the independent-minded Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights as separate entities would be a recipe for confusion, delay, and missed opportunities. The orders would jockey for position, argue over strategy, and potentially pursue their own agendas, diluting the strength of the entire expedition. Theobald recognized that to achieve any meaningful success, he needed to break this cycle of competition before it could even begin. His solution was both simple and revolutionary for the time. He did not request the orders to cooperate. He demanded it as the overall commander of the crusade. Using his considerable royal authority and the sheer prestige of his position, Theobald instituted a policy of temporary operational mergers. For the duration of a specific campaign or battle, the distinct contingents of knights from the various orders would be placed under a single, unified command. This was not a vague agreement to work together. It was a formal military structure. A Templar battalion and a Hospitaller company, for example, would be combined into a single division for a planned assault on a strategic objective. Crucially, Theobald would appoint a single commander for this combined force, a trusted baron from his own retinue or a senior military officer whose authority was unquestioned. This commander would then issue orders to the entire division as one unit, bypassing the individual chain of command of each order for the tactical duration of the operation. The effect of this temporary merger was transformative. Instead of a collection of proud but disjointed units, each with its own banner and its own commander to please, Theobald created a cohesive, disciplined army. On the march, this meant a single, coordinated column instead of a scattered collection of rival contingents. In battle, it meant that a charge could be launched with the full weight of the combined force, hitting the enemy like a fist instead of a set of separate fingers. This unified approach paid dramatic dividends. During the campaign, Theobald's forces achieved a series of significant, if localized, victories. They successfully marched on the city of Ascalon, reinforcing its defenses and securing the southern frontier. In a clever and bloodless diplomatic coup, they leveraged their unified military presence to negotiate the restoration of Jerusalem to Christian control through a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan of Damascus. This was a stunning achievement, returning the Holy City to Crusader hands without a costly siege. The success of these operations was a direct result of the temporary merger of forces. A divided army, arguing over the spoils of victory or the glory of being first through the breach, could never have moved with the speed and discipline required for such complex maneuvers. The orders, for their part, acquiesced to this arrangement because Theobald's leadership was strong, his goals were clear, and his strategy was proving successful. They saw tangible benefits from setting aside their independence, benefits that served their long-term interest in a stronger Crusader presence. The Baron's Crusade stands as a powerful testament to what could be accomplished when a secular leader possessed both the vision and the authority to impose unity. It proved that the military orders, for all their institutional pride, would submit to a centralized command if it led to victory. This model of a temporary merger under a powerful king offered a glimpse of an alternative path for the Crusader states, one where coordination replaced competition. Yet it was a model that could not be sustained. Theobald eventually returned to Europe, and with his departure, the strong hand that had forced cooperation was removed. The orders quickly reverted to their independent ways, their brief experiment in unity fading into memory, a poignant reminder of what might have been if such cohesive leadership had been a permanent feature of the Crusader world. The world of the Crusader states was not solely governed by the clash of armies or the decrees of kings. It was also shaped in the quiet, candlelit chambers where dynasties were forged. While the military orders were sworn to chastity as individual brothers, their institutions operated with a shrewd understanding of power that extended far beyond the battlefield. One of the most subtle yet profound methods they used to secure their influence was not through a treaty or a truce, but through the strategic placement of their most well-connected members into the very heart of the secular aristocracy. When a prominent knight, perhaps the brother or cousin of a high-ranking official within an order like the Templars or Hospitallers, married into a powerful noble family like the Ibelins or the Lusignans, it created an unbreakable bond of blood and shared interest. This was not a formal alliance between two military brotherhoods, but something even more potent, a de facto political merger that wove the orders directly into the fabric of the kingdom's ruling class. Imagine a scenario where the Baron of Beirut, a lord whose lands are crucial for the defense of the coast, finds his daughter married to the nephew of the Templar Grand Master. Suddenly, the Baron's concerns are the Templars' concerns. When he pleads for reinforcements to garrison his castles, his voice carries the weight of a family connection, making it far more difficult for the order to refuse. Conversely, the Templars gain a powerful advocate within the royal council, a man who understands their needs and will argue for granting them a strategically vital piece of land or a generous donation from the royal treasury. These marriage alliances transformed the orders from external power brokers into internal stakeholders with a direct, personal vested interest in the survival and prosperity of the secular lords they were tied to. A decision to withhold troops from a campaign was no longer just a strategic calculation. It was a potential betrayal of a father-in-law or a brother by marriage. This complex web of familial obligation ensured that when the kingdom was threatened, the military orders were far more likely to commit their resources fully, not merely out of a sense of religious duty, but to protect the lands and titles of their own extended family. This system also worked in reverse, providing the orders with invaluable intelligence and political leverage. A Templar-connected nobleman sitting in the High Court of Jerusalem would have advanced knowledge of royal decrees, diplomatic initiatives, or plots against the orders. This inside information allowed the Templars to anticipate challenges and maneuver accordingly, securing their position long before a public confrontation could arise. The strategic marriage was the ultimate tool of soft power, a way to build an unassailable political foundation stone by stone, marriage by marriage, ensuring that the fortunes of the cross and the crown remained inextricably linked in the defense of the Holy Land. The year 1312 marked not a battle but a legal execution. With a stroke of a papal pen, the Order of the Knights Templar, once the most powerful financial and military institution in Christendom, was officially dissolved. The charges against them, ranging from heresy to corruption, were likely fabricated by a cash-strapped King Philip IV of France, who coveted their immense wealth, but the result was devastatingly final. The Templars were gone, their Grand Master burned at the stake, their order dismantled. In the wake of this shocking collapse, a monumental question hung over Europe and the remnants of the Crusader world. What was to become of the Templars' vast empire? Their network of commanderies, farms, mills, and castles stretched from Scotland to Cyprus, a sprawling economic engine that had funded their operations for nearly 2 centuries. This fortune was now a prize, and every king and noble who had ever borrowed from the Templar treasury eyed it greedily. But in a move that stunned many secular rulers, Pope Clement V issued a final decree. The vast bulk of the Templar assets, their properties, their revenues, and even many of their surviving members were to be transferred to their oldest and most bitter rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. This was not an alliance born of shared strategy or mutual need, but a forced marriage dictated by the highest authority in the Church. It was the ultimate irony, a final, one-sided pact that saw the Hospitallers absorb the very essence of their former competitors. For the Hospitallers, who had themselves been struggling to maintain their foothold in the Mediterranean from their base on Rhodes, this windfall was nothing short of miraculous. It was as if a bankrupt corporation had suddenly inherited the assets of its largest competitor. Overnight, the Hospitallers' economic power doubled, perhaps even tripled. The steady stream of rental income from Templar estates in France, the profits from their former trading operations in Italy, the revenues from countless villages and farms across England and Spain, all now flowed into the Hospitaller treasury. This sudden infusion of wealth transformed their prospects. It provided the solid financial foundation they desperately needed to fund their ambitious naval campaigns, to build and maintain the powerful fleet of galleys that would make them the scourge of Muslim shipping in the Aegean Sea. They could now afford to recruit more knights, build stronger fortifications on Rhodes, and project power across the eastern Mediterranean with a confidence they hadn't possessed for generations. Yet this absorption was far from a simple administrative transfer. It was a complex and often messy process, fraught with resistance. Secular monarchs, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula where the Reconquista was still underway, often ignored the papal order, seizing Templar properties for their own royal coffers or handing them over to local orders like Calatrava or Santiago. In other regions, the integration of former Templar brothers into the Hospitaller ranks created inevitable friction. These were men who had been trained in a different tradition, who answered to a different rule, and who now had to swear new oaths to an order they had spent their lives competing against. The assimilation was a delicate and prolonged affair, but its ultimate success cemented the Hospitallers' future. This final, forced alliance represents the closing of a profound historical circle. For 2 centuries, the Templars and Hospitallers had defined the Crusader experience through their rivalry, their temporary truces, and their secret collaborations. They had been 2 sides of the same coin, sometimes clashing, sometimes cooperating, but always shaping the destiny of the Latin East. Now, in a final, papal-engineered transaction, their stories merged. The Templars' legacy, their wealth and their remaining manpower became the fuel for the Hospitallers' continued survival and their eventual transformation into the Knights of Malta, an order that would endure for centuries to come. It was a conclusion that none could have predicted at the height of their competition, a stark lesson in how the tides of history can turn the greatest of rivals into a single, enduring legacy. So the story we have been taught of a 200-year war defined solely by religious hatred begins to crumble when we hold it up to the light of these 25 forgotten alliances. What emerges in its place is a far more complex and human picture, a world where survival was the ultimate ideology. The Templar who secretly negotiated with an assassin, the Hospitaller who accepted a castle from an Armenian king, the Teutonic Knight sharing a naval patrol with a Byzantine admiral. These were not heretics betraying their cause. They were pragmatists navigating an impossible situation, making difficult choices in the shadows to ensure that their orders, their brothers, and their mission would see another sunrise. This hidden history of realpolitik challenges the very core of the simplistic Crusader myth, revealing that the path to victory, or even just to survival, was often paved with compromise and calculated cooperation. The legacy of these partnerships is a powerful reminder that history is rarely a story of pure good versus pure evil, but rather a messy, intricate tapestry woven from threads of conflict and, just as importantly, from threads of collaboration. It shows us that even in the heart of a holy war where identities were built on opposition, the need for a common front against a shared threat could create the most unexpected of bedfellows. These stories have been overlooked for centuries, perhaps because they complicate a narrative we find easier to understand. But in rediscovering them, we gain a much richer, more accurate, and ultimately more fascinating understanding of this pivotal era. We see the Crusades not as a monolithic clash of civilizations, but as a dynamic and fluid conflict where the lines between friend and foe were constantly being redrawn by the harsh necessities of the moment. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 25 forgotten alliances did you find the most surprising? Was it the secret pact at Montgisard that leveraged the unique knowledge of the Lazarites, or the stunningly pragmatic joint financing of Safed Castle by the Templars and Hospitallers? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey into the hidden diplomacy of the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the secrets history tried to forget.